Buckle up, everybody, because we are diving headfirst into the biggest global news stories that hit us on New Year's Day 2025.
Yeah, we've got quite a mix this time.
Right. It's like a cocktail of chaos, shocking incidents, political clashes, and, those climate concerns we can't seem to shake off.
Oh, and don't
Oh,
forget,
yeah.
a sprinkle of the bizarre.
Exactly. So to kick things off, we're zeroing in on three major stories that really grabbed our attention. First, we'll head down to Bourbon Street in New Orleans, where a terrifying act of violence unfolded. Then we'll jump over to Puerto Rico, which was unfortunately plunged into darkness by a major power outage. And finally, we'll unpack some significant policy shifts in the U.S. regarding the H-1B visa program. Let's start with that chilling incident in New Orleans. Imagine you're out celebrating the new year on Bourbon Street, and suddenly a pickup truck comes barreling through the crowd. It's a horrifying thought, and tragically this became a reality, leaving 10 people dead and 35 injured.
It's hard to even fathom the fear and chaos that must have erupted in those moments.
Absolutely, and what makes this even more disturbing is the deliberate nature of this attack.
Right. The New Orleans police chief, Ann Kirkpatrick, didn't mince words. She stated that the driver, 42-year-old Shamsuddin Jabbar, was trying to run over as many people as he possibly could. It's chilling.
Yeah, absolutely chilling.
Yeah.
He then exited the vehicle and engaged in a shootout with police before being fatally shot. It's a stark reminder of the vulnerability we all face in public spaces, especially during large gatherings when we're supposed to be celebrating.
You know, it really makes you question how we can protect ourselves from these kinds of threats without sacrificing our freedom of movement and our ability to enjoy public spaces.
It's a tough question with no easy answers, but one that we need to grapple with. And to make matters even more complex, an ISIS flag was found on the truck, leading the FBI to investigate the attack as a potential act of terrorism.
That adds a whole other layer to this tragedy, right? The possibility of extremist ideologies motivating violence even within the U.S., it's a sobering thought.
It really is, and I think it's going to spark a lot of debate about domestic surveillance intelligence gathering and the balance between security and civil liberties.
It's a conversation we need to have, even if it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely. Now, beyond the immediate victims, this tragedy also had ripple effects. One of the biggest college football games of the year, the Sugar Bowl, was scheduled to take place in New Orleans that day and had to be postponed due to security concerns.
That's right. It's a stark reminder that these events can disrupt our lives in unexpected ways and cast a shadow over what should be times of celebration.
So while New Orleans grapples with this tragedy, another part of the world faced a different kind of crisis on New Year's Eve.
Wow.
A massive power outage hit Puerto Rico, plunging over 1 million households into darkness.
No lights, no refrigeration right in the middle of holiday celebrations. It doesn't get much worse than that.
Yeah, talk about bad timing.
Yeah.
And it really highlights the fragility of our infrastructure systems. The cause of this blackout was a fault in an underground line which triggered a system-wide failure.
You know, it's pretty concerning that a single point of failure can have such widespread consequences.
For sure, and it's impossible not to think back to the devastation caused by Hurricane Maria in 2017. It seems like despite billions of dollars spent on rebuilding Puerto Rico's power grid is still vulnerable to these massive failures.
Governor Pedro Pierluisi didn't hold back. He called it a critical failure in the electrical system, and it's hard to disagree.
This isn't just an inconvenience, it's a major setback for the island's recovery, and a stark reminder that true resilience requires more than just rebuilding what was there before. It's about building back better and addressing those underlying vulnerabilities.
Now, shifting gears to a story that's a bit more policy-focused, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security announced some pretty major changes to the H-1B visa program.
For those who might not be familiar, the H-1B visa allows U.S. companies to employ foreign workers in specialty occupations that require theoretical or technical expertise. So think engineers, computer programmers, scientists, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and this is a big deal, especially for skilled workers from countries like India who've historically faced long wait times and a ton of bureaucratic hurdles because of the per-country cap on these visas.
So break it down for us. What's the most significant change here?
Well, the biggest change is that they're getting rid of that per-country cap, which basically limited the number of H-1B visas that could be issued to applicants from any single country. It created these massive backlogs and disproportionately impacted professionals from India, which, as you know, has a huge pool of highly skilled tech workers.
So instead of being limited by their nationality, applicants will now be assessed based on their qualifications and skills.
Exactly. It's a shift towards a more merit-based system, which is designed to level the playing field and reduce those ridiculous wait times for visas.
It's interesting that even Donald Trump, who's known for his hardline stance on immigration, has expressed support for this kind of reform in the past. He actually said, and I quote, "I've always liked the H-1B visas. I have always been in favor of the visas. That's why we have them."
That's right. The H-1B visa program has always been kind of a hot-button issue, with supporters arguing that it helps fill crucial skill gaps in the U.S. economy, and opponents concerned about job displacement for American workers. This new reform is bound to reignite those debates.
Yeah, it raises a lot of questions. Will this reform actually level the playing field? How will it impact the U.S. tech industry? And what about the social and economic implications for both the U.S. and India?
These are all things we need to keep an eye on as this new system rolls out. It's going to be interesting, to say the least.
Well, we've covered some pretty heavy topics so far. Terrorist attacks, power outages, visa reforms. It's a lot to process. Maybe you need to lighten the mood a bit.
A little dose of weirdness never hurt anyone.
Exactly. So let's take a quick detour into the land of bizarre news. First up, we have a teenager in Mumbai who managed to crash a Porsche into a row of parked motorcycles.
Oh man, talk about an expensive fender bender.
Right. I can only imagine the look on his parents' faces when they got that phone call.
Yeah, I bet that was a fun conversation.
Yeah. Now, for our next dose of bizarre news, we have a story that highlights the potential pitfalls of relying too heavily on technology. In Uttar Pradesh, India, Google Maps led a car onto an unfinished flyover.
Wait, what?
Yeah, you heard that right. Google Maps led them astray, and unfortunately, it resulted in fatalities.
Oh, wow. That's just tragic. It's a stark reminder that even the most advanced technology isn't foolproof. We still need to use our own judgment and be aware of our surroundings.
Absolutely. Sometimes good old-fashioned common sense is the best navigation tool. Blindly following that blue dot can lead you down a dangerous path, sometimes literally.
It's crazy to think that something as simple as a GPS error can have such dire consequences.
So there you have it, folks. From acts of terror and infrastructure failures to political maneuvering and climate concerns, January 1st, 2025 certainly didn't disappoint in terms of newsworthy events.
And we even managed to squeeze in some bizarre and wacky headlines for good measure.
It just goes to show, even on New Year's Day, the world doesn't stop spinning.
That's for sure. But hey, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We're going to go deeper into these stories and explore their potential implications in the next part of our deep dive.
You got it. So before we move on, we want to leave you with a question to ponder. What did these stories tell us about the state of the world in 2025? Are we witnessing increasing instability, or are these isolated incidents in an otherwise interconnected world?
And what issues do you think will dominate the headlines in the year ahead?
Food for thought, right? Stick around for part 2, where we'll connect the dots and analyze the broader trends and implications of these events. We'll be right back after a short break.
Welcome back, everyone. We're picking up where we left off, diving deeper into some of the major global news stories from January 1st, 2025. In part 1, we touched on some pretty intense stuff. That terrorist attack in New Orleans, the blackout that hit Puerto Rico, and of course, those changes to the H-1B visa program. We even took a little detour into the world of bizarre news, just to lighten things up a bit.
Well, now it's time to roll up our sleeves and go beyond the headlines. Exactly. Let's connect the dots and see if we can identify any larger trends emerging from these events.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so let's start by revisiting that horrific attack in New Orleans. It's a chilling reminder that the threat of terrorism is unfortunately still very real even here in the U.S. after all the security measures put in place since 9/11.
Yeah, and the way this attack was carried out, using a vehicle as a weapon, is particularly concerning. We've seen this tactic employed more and more frequently in recent years.
It's terrifying because it's a relatively low-tech method, right?
Right. It doesn't require sophisticated weaponry or extensive planning, and yet it can inflict mass casualties. And it's incredibly difficult to prevent.
And to make matters even more complex, the perpetrator in this case was a U.S.-born citizen, which adds another layer of complexity to the issue of terrorism.
It really challenges that traditional notion of terrorism as something that comes from outside our borders and forces us to confront the reality of homegrown radicalization.
It's scary to think about how do we even begin to identify and address those kinds of threats.
It's a tough question, and I think this incident will definitely spark renewed debates about domestic surveillance intelligence gathering. That whole balance between security and civil liberties.
It's a conversation we've been having for a long time, and it's one that's not going away anytime soon.
Definitely not. This attack really brings those issues to the forefront.
And it also makes you think about the vulnerability of public spaces. I mean, can we ever truly feel safe attending a concert, a sporting event, or even just walking down a crowded street knowing that something like this could happen?
It's a question that weighs heavily on a lot of people's minds, right?
It does. And while there's no easy answer, I think we need to be having a serious conversation about how we can enhance security without turning our public spaces into fortresses.
Yeah, finding that balance is crucial.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about that power outage in Puerto Rico. On the surface, it might seem like an isolated incident, but I think it speaks to a much larger issue of fragile infrastructure, not just in Puerto Rico, but around the world.
I couldn't agree more. We've seen similar blackouts in other countries caused by things like aging infrastructure, extreme weather events, even cyber attacks.
It's a wake-up call, right?
It is. It's a reminder that our dependence on electricity is both a blessing and a curse. When these systems fail, the consequences can be devastating.
Think about it for a second. Hospitals, businesses, schools, entire communities can be paralyzed when the power goes out. And for a place like Puerto Rico that's still recovering from the devastation of Hurricane Maria, this blackout is a major setback.
Yeah, it's a heartbreaking situation, and it really highlights the long-term consequences of underinvestment in infrastructure.
You can pour billions of dollars into rebuilding after a disaster, but if you don't address those underlying vulnerabilities, you're just setting yourself up for the next failure.
Exactly. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. You need to fix the root of the problem, not just the symptoms.
True resilience requires a much more forward-thinking approach.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so we've talked about terrorism and infrastructure. Now let's move on to the H-1B visa reform. This is a major policy shift that could have significant implications for the U.S. economy and for global talent flows.
It's a big deal for sure. So for our listeners who might not be familiar with the H-1B visa, it's essentially a non-immigrant visa that allows U.S. companies to employ foreign workers in specialty occupations that require highly specialized knowledge and skills.
So we're talking about engineers, computer programmers, scientists, the folks who are driving innovation in a lot of industries.
Exactly. And for a long time, the H-1B visa program has been a vital pathway for talented individuals from all over the world to come to the U.S. and contribute their skills to our economy.
But one of the biggest criticisms of the previous system was that per-country cap, which really limited the number of visas that could be granted to applicants from any single country each year.
Yeah, it ended up creating these huge backlogs, especially for skilled workers from India, which, has a massive pool of talented engineers and IT professionals.
It seems incredibly unfair that someone's chances of working in the U.S. could be limited simply because of their nationality.
That's the argument that many people have made. And that's why this new reform, eliminating the per-country cap, is seen as such a significant shift. It's a move towards a more merit-based system, where the focus is on the applicant's individual qualifications rather than their country of origin.
So in theory, this should level the playing field and give everyone a fair shot regardless of where they come from.
That's the hope anyway. This change has been praised by many folks, including Vivek Ramaswamy, who argue that it's a win-win for everyone involved. U.S. companies get access to a larger pool of talent, and foreign workers have a more equitable opportunity to contribute their skills to the U.S. economy.
And it's interesting that even Donald Trump, who was often associated with a stricter approach to immigration, has expressed support for this kind of merit-based system in the past.
Yes, indeed. The H-1B visa program has always been a somewhat controversial topic, with some people arguing that it takes jobs away from American workers.
So it's going to be fascinating to see how this new reform plays out in the long run.
Agreed. There will likely be both intended and unintended consequences that we need to monitor closely.
So stepping back for a moment and looking at these three stories together, what larger trends do you see emerging?
Well, one thing that jumps out at me is the increasing interconnectedness of our world. Whether it's the threat of terrorism, the vulnerability of our infrastructure, or the flow of global talent, what happens in one part of the world can have a ripple effect across the globe.
You're right. It's like we're all part of this intricate web. And events that might seem isolated at first can actually have far-reaching consequences.
Exactly. We're living in a globalized world where borders are becoming increasingly porous and information travels at the speed of light.
It's both exciting and terrifying at the same time, right?
It is.
Yeah.
We have the potential to connect and collaborate in amazing ways, but we're also more vulnerable to shocks and disruptions that can originate anywhere in the world.
And speaking of global challenges, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, climate change. Those record-breaking temperatures in India are just one example of the extreme weather events that are becoming more and more frequent and intense around the world.
Climate change is no longer a distant threat. It's a present reality that's affecting people's lives right now. From heat waves and droughts to floods and wildfires, the consequences are being felt everywhere.
And the scary thing is, it's only going to get worse if we don't take action.
Absolutely. We need to transition to a clean energy economy as quickly as possible invest in climate adaptation and resilience measures, and work to protect our natural ecosystems.
Those are all big systemic changes, but what can we do as individuals to make a difference?
It can feel overwhelming, but even small changes can have a cumulative impact. We can reduce our energy consumption, choose sustainable products, support businesses that are committed to environmental responsibility, and advocate for policies that address climate change.
So it's about both individual actions and collective action.
Exactly. We need a multi-pronged approach. We need governments to enact policies that promote sustainability. We need businesses to adopt responsible practices. And we need individuals to make conscious choices in their daily lives.
It's about creating a culture of sustainability.
You got it. It's a long-term project, but it's one that we need to start working on now.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the headlines of January 1st, 2025, to some of the broader trends they reveal about the state of our world. What's the key takeaway for our listeners?
I think the key takeaway is that we live in a complex, rapidly changing world, and there are definitely challenges ahead.
No doubt about that.
But there are also opportunities for positive change. By staying informed, engaged, and hopeful, we can navigate these uncertain times and work together to build a better future.
Well said. I couldn't agree more. So to wrap up this part of our deep dive, we want to leave you with a question to ponder as we head into the final part.
What gives you hope in the face of all these challenges? What actions can we take, both individually and collectively, to create a more just, equitable, and sustainable world?
We'll explore these questions and more in part 3, where we'll delve into some potential scenarios for the year ahead and discuss what we can do to shape a more positive future. Stay tuned. And we're back for the final leg of our deep dive into the top global news from January 1st, 2025. If you've been with us from the start, you know we've covered some major ground, from a terrorist attack in New Orleans to a massive power outage in Puerto Rico, not to mention those significant changes to the H-1B visa program.
And we didn't shy away from the tough questions either. We talked about the underlying trends these events highlight, like the growing interconnectedness of our world and the looming shadow of climate change.
Now it's time to put on our prognosticator hats and look ahead. What might the rest of 2025 have in store for us?
Predicting the future is always a risky business.
Oh, for sure.
But we can look at the events we've already discussed and try to identify some potential scenarios that might play out.
All right, so let's play what if for a bit. Where should we start?
Well, the global landscape is looking pretty tense right now. So one area to watch closely is the relationship between the U.S. and other major powers like China and Russia.
Yeah, things have been a bit frosty for a while now.
If the attack in New Orleans is definitively linked to international terrorist groups, it could definitely escalate those tensions and lead to a more unpredictable and potentially dangerous global security environment.
That's a scary thought. And here in the U.S., we're probably in for a wild ride politically, especially with the 2026 presidential election cycle already looming on the horizon.
Oh yeah, buckle up for that one. Those accusations from Trump about obstruction by Senate Democrats are likely just a preview of the partisan battles that will dominate the headlines in the coming months.
It's going to be interesting to see how all of that unfolds.
Speaking of unfolding, let's talk about the economy. Are we headed for a recession, or can we hope for continued growth?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. There are factors that could push us towards a recession, like rising inflation and interest rates we've been seeing, not to mention the geopolitical instability and those ongoing supply chain issues that just won't seem to go away.
It's a recipe for economic indigestion.
On the other hand, there are also signs of resilience in the global economy, like strong consumer demand and the continued pace of technological innovation. So it's a mixed bag, really.
It sounds like we need to brace ourselves for volatility.
That's probably a safe bet.
And of course, we can't forget about climate change. It's the wild card that could throw all of our predictions out the window.
Sadly, we're likely to see more of what we've already been experiencing, more frequent and intense heat waves, droughts, floods, wildfires, and rising sea levels. It's a grim reality, but we need to face it head on.
So what can we do? Is it too late to turn things around?
It's not too late to take action, but we need to act decisively and collectively. We need to accelerate the transition to a clean energy economy, invest in climate adaptation and resilience measures, and protect our natural ecosystems. The longer we wait, the harder it will be.
Those are big systemic changes, but what about on an individual level? What can we do in our own lives to make a difference?
Even small changes can add up. We can reduce our energy consumption at home and choose sustainable products. Support businesses that are committed to environmental responsibility, and most importantly, make our voices heard by advocating for policies that address climate change.
It sounds like we all need to step up and do our part.
That's exactly right. It's going to take a collective effort to tackle these global challenges.
Well, we've explored some pretty complex and frankly daunting issues today, but I think it's important to end on a note of hope.
I agree. Amidst all the challenges we face, there's also a growing awareness of these issues and a surge in activism and engagement.
People are demanding action, and that's a powerful force for change.
It is. We have the power to shape the future, but it requires us to be informed, engaged, and most importantly, hopeful.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the top global news from January 1st, 2025, we want to leave you with a final thought. Don't be afraid to engage with the news, even when it's tough to hear. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay hopeful because together we can create a better world.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the news that matters.